All right, welcome. We're diving into something you brought up. It's how companies decide where and how to actually produce their goods and services all over the world globally. You shared a chapter about global sourcing and outsourcing and offshoring.
Yeah.
And today, we want to kind of extract those key insights from it, those nuggets that'll help you understand the reasons behind all these decisions, because it can be pretty complex.
It can be, yeah.
And so the chapter starts with this question. Where should a firm locate its production activities?
Right.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, at first.
But as we'll see, the answer is way more complex.
It is, yeah. Like, just to give you an example, the chapter mentions BMW.
Okay.
They have production in something like 13 different countries.
Wow.
And each location that they chose to have production in, they chose it very deliberately. So in one country, it might be for, certain skills that workers have.
Right.
In another, it might be to drive down costs.
Sure.
Another, just to be closer to the customer. So there's no, one-size-fits-all answer.
It's not that simple.
Not at all.
Okay. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, the chapter lays out some key definitions. So
Right.
let's start with global sourcing, outsourcing, offshoring. What are the differences between these?
Sure. So global sourcing, as the chapter defines it, is basically like a buying strategy. So a business looks across international borders, right, to purchase the goods and services that it needs, often to find better pricing, more competitive pricing, maybe on raw materials or skilled labor in another part of the world. So it's casting a wide net internationally to get the best stuff, basically, for their business.
So sourcing is about getting what you need across borders. So how does outsourcing differ from that?
Outsourcing is about delegating an entire business function to an external provider. So this could be anything from, having a certain component manufactured to even managing your IT infrastructure or even customer service. The main difference from global sourcing, though, is outsourcing doesn't have to be across borders.
Okay.
It can be to a company in your own city.
So it could be domestic.
Yeah.
Got it. So sourcing is international procurement. Outsourcing is handing off a function. Okay, now offshoring, we hear that a lot.
So offshoring is the act of actually relocating a business process from one country to another. So it could be setting up a manufacturing plant, in a different country, or maybe contracting with a third party that is overseas. But the main defining characteristic here is this geographic shift of the activity to a different nation.
Got it. So just to kind of recap, global sourcing, international buying, outsourcing,
validating,
handing off a function, offshoring,
moving a business process to another country.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And the chapter also mentions this concept of make or buy, which seems to kind of be like the basis behind all of this.
It is, yeah. So at the core of all these global sourcing and production location choices, there's this fundamental question. Should a company perform an activity itself, or should it rely on external suppliers to perform it for them? So that's what they're talking about, this make or buy decision.
Yeah.
Internalization versus externalization.
Got it. Okay, so now that the chapter mentions two primary objectives.
Right.
So lowering costs and improving quality. They mention an example of Hyundai in India, where they sought lower labor costs.
Yeah, they did. But it's interesting, the chapter points out that actually improving quality can lead to lower costs by reducing defects and waste.
So like less rework and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always just this race to the bottom in terms of the lowest cost, Sometimes it's about investing in a location or a process that can give you higher quality up front, because that will then save you money in the long run.
That makes sense.
Yeah, minimize errors.
Okay, so the chapter then breaks down these factors that influence where a company decides to produce.
Right.
They break it down into four main categories. So we have country factors, fixed costs, technological factors, and product factors. So let's start with country factors.
Okay.
So at the country level, what are we talking about here?
Sure. So first and foremost, you need to look at the availability of skilled labor, right? Do you have the people?
Yeah.
And do they have the skills that you need?
Yeah.
And also, are there supporting industries there?
Okay.
So, the network of suppliers and related businesses that can actually support your operations effectively.
Got it.
And then, of course, there's the government regulations concerning foreign direct investment, FDI, and trade. The chapter goes into these in more detail, like in chapters 2 and 4, but basically, how easy does a country make it for companies to invest in trade?
Right.
That's a big factor.
Sure.
And then, of course, currency stability, 4x. That's super important.
Of course, yeah.
It's all detailed out in Chapter 6, but you don't want your profits and costs to be, at the mercy of wildly fluctuating exchange rates.
Of course. And then, of course, last but not least, transportation costs, right?
Yeah.
Especially in today's global interconnected supply chains. The example they give in the chapter is Philips in China. They've been there since like 1985. And that was to tap into lower labor costs.
Right.
Both to serve, like, the Chinese market and for global exports.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to fixed costs.
Okay.
The chapter mentions this inverse relationship between fixed costs and the number of production locations. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. So basically, if the upfront cost of setting up a production facility is really high, a company's going to want to serve the global market from a smaller number of locations, maybe even just one, because they have those fixed costs. And they want to maximize their utilization of that investment, basically. They use the example of pharmaceuticals. Like, you might see some medicines being produced in multiple countries for regulatory reasons or maybe access to the market. But the core components, because they have huge upfront fixed costs, are going to be centralized. R&D and specialized manufacturing equipment, all that.
Right.
And conversely, if the fixed costs are relatively low, then it might make more sense for a company to have several production locations. I have a question for you, though. Can you think of an industry where the fixed costs of production might be relatively low, so you might see it more dispersed?
Well, with the pandemic, I think it kind of showed us that maybe something like software development.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Where the main fixed cost is talent, and that talent can be, distributed all over the world.
Yeah, and now with the advent of everyone being able to work remotely,
Exactly.
That's a great example, yeah.
Okay. So, and this idea of fixed costs also kind of connects to this idea of efficient scale, right?
It does, yeah.
So how does that play into it?
So if a plant needs to operate at a really large volume to achieve cost efficiency,
Okay.
then you're going to see that production is probably going to be in fewer locations, right?
Right, because you need to be able to justify the
you need to be able to
big scale.
Generate enough demand to keep those larger facilities running efficiently.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's move on to technological factors.
Okay.
It's really striking how much things have changed. The chapter contrasts these traditional economies of scale with today's flexible manufacturing.
Right. Or lean production.
Yeah. So how has that impacted this decision about where to locate production?
So traditionally, economies of scale favored mass production of standardized goods in large centralized factories.
Yeah.
But, today with all the modern flexible manufacturing technologies,
right,
companies can produce a much wider variety of products.
Right.
And they can do it with shorter setup times. And the costs are much closer to those of mass production.
So you get the benefit of the mass production, but without having to have the big scale, the huge scale.
Yeah. So mass customization, it's where you tailor products to the specific needs of different national markets.
Oh, wow.
And you do it without the huge cost penalty.
So I could order a car from BMW and it has exactly what I want in it, but it doesn't cost me a fortune more to get those little tweaks.
Exactly, yeah. So they actually mention Toyota in the chapter because Toyota successfully pursues low cost and differentiation at the same time.
Oh, interesting.
And that's something that, in the traditional Porter framework, that was seen as a trade-off.
Right. So that's kind of moving beyond that.
It is, yeah.
And really interesting is that this flexibility can lead to more localized production.
It can, yeah.
Because now you don't need these massive centralized plants just to get those cost efficiencies.
Exactly.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have the last one, product factors.
Right.
And here, the chapter really emphasizes the value-to-weight ratio and level of standardization. So how do these influence the decision?
So value-to-weight ratio is pretty intuitive. Basically, if you have a product with a high value, but it doesn't weigh much, they give the example of pharmaceuticals, then the transportation cost is relatively small.
Right.
So it makes more sense to produce in a single location and then just ship it out all over the world.
Sure.
Now, if you have a product with a low value relative to its weight, like cement or cars, then the transportation costs are going to be a much more significant factor.
Yeah.
So it might make more sense to have multiple locations that are closer to their markets.
Yeah. So ship the expensive stuff globally, make the heavy stuff locally.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. And what about level of standardization? How does that play into it?
So if you have a product where the consumer tastes and preferences are pretty similar across different markets, then there's less need to like tailor the product.
Right.
So you can centralize manufacturing of a standardized product, and that's going to be more cost effective.
Okay.
But if there are significant differences in what consumers want in different countries, you know, like food products,
Yeah.
then you might need to have more localized production to be able to be responsive to those local tastes and preferences.
Got it. So putting it all together, all these location factors from the country, the fixed costs, the technology, the product itself, it really seems like this decision, like to have this single centralized production or to have these multiple, more dispersed locations, it's a real balancing act.
Yeah. And to add to that complexity, the chapter points out that these factors aren't static, you know? So a location that might seem strategically advantageous now, it might change over time. Like maybe the government regulations change.
Right.
Or a country develops its infrastructure more, or, you know, the workforce's skills get better, or even a company's own capabilities in that location change.
Yeah, it's not static at all.
No. And they actually give a few examples. So Hewlett-Packard in Singapore, they actually expanded to include design and assembly over time.
Okay.
Hyundai in India added R&D.
Wow.
And the chapter connects this to global learning, which is this idea that, you know, within a transnational strategy, you're always learning.
Right.
And the GE Mac 400 project in India is another good example of this, like valuable knowledge and capabilities emerging from overseas subsidiaries.
So it's really about setting up shop, but then it's also about evolving within that location.
Exactly. It's continuous learning and adaptation.
Yeah. That's not a one-time decision.
No.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about this make or buy decision in more detail.
Okay.
The chapter highlights this increasing trend of MNEs, multinational enterprises, relying on outside companies for significant components and services. They mentioned Toyota produces less than 30% of its cars' value in-house. So what's driving this reliance on outside suppliers?
So one of the big things, of course, is efficiency. So by outsourcing certain components or functions to specialized suppliers that can produce them, you know, more cost effectively or maybe with higher quality because they're more specialized, MNEs can often lower their costs overall and concentrate on what they're good at.
Right, their core competencies.
Right, exactly.
But the chapter also makes it clear that not all activities are outsourced.
Right. Right. They keep in-house, like, the activities that are central to their competitive advantage.
Right.
Or maybe that involve proprietary knowledge and trade secrets. So this internal production, it's called vertical integration.
Okay. And they emphasize that this make or buy decision, it gets a lot more complicated when you're operating in international markets.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
As opposed to just within your home country.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of those added layers of complexity?
So when you're dealing with international markets, you have to navigate different legal and regulatory frameworks.
Right.
You have to deal with, like, varying levels of supplier capabilities, like how reliable are they, you know, in different countries. And then there's potential cultural and communication hurdles.
Of course.
And then it just gets more complex to manage, like international contracts and relationships.
It's just a whole other ballgame.
It is, yeah.
So let's talk about some of the specific advantages of choosing to make in-house vertical integration.
Sure. So one of the biggest is potentially lower costs, and this is this is only if a company is already like the most efficient producer.
Okay.
They use Boeing as an example, you know. So if you're already the most efficient, then outsourcing to someone that's less efficient wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
Another advantage is, you know, this idea of facilitating investments in specialized assets. So if a company requires like really unique equipment that is crucial for its competitive edge, they're going to want to keep that in-house.
Okay.
So Nissan, as an example, they decided to produce a new fuel injection system in-house.
Okay.
So that's a good example. Another is protecting proprietary technology.
Of course. Yeah.
So Boeing manufactures their own advanced cockpit systems in-house.
Makes sense.
You know, they don't want to risk losing control over that.
Sure.
And then the last advantage is that it can streamline the scheduling of interdependent processes.
Okay.
And this is particularly beneficial for companies that use like just-in-time inventory management systems.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So there's lots of good reasons to keep it in-house. But on the other hand, there's reasons to buy or outsource.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are some of those?
Well, often the main one is cost.
Okay.
Lower costs.
Yeah.
And, the chapter details a bunch of reasons for that.
Yep.
One, you can avoid those internal coordination costs.
Okay.
You can also avoid this problem of being a captive customer of an internal supplier.
Right.
Where you might not get the best price or the best service.
Right, right.
You can also avoid having to deal with these complicated transfer prices.
Okay.
And then you can capitalize on these economies of scale that external suppliers might get by serving a bunch of customers.
Right. So it might actually be cheaper to
Yeah.
have somebody else do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can also give you more strategic flexibility.
Okay.
So by going with independent suppliers, a company can more easily switch to a different supplier as the market conditions change or as their needs change.
Yeah.
Especially if they have, good buyer power.
Right.
And then there's this other idea of order capture.
What's that?
It's where, by agreeing to outsource some work to local suppliers in a market, it can actually help you win a larger contract. And they use the example of Boeing and Air India.
Okay.
So that's a strategic use of outsourcing.
Wow.
Yeah. To gain market access.
That's really fascinating how that kind of works together with the larger strategic picture of the organization.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, the chapter has a section on offshoring global services and production.
Right.
And they start by really clarifying the difference between outsourcing and offshoring, which we kind of touched on. But it's really important to keep these things distinct in our mind.
It is, yeah. So offshoring is about geographic relocation.
Okay.
Outsourcing is about delegating a function to a third party. And that third party could be anywhere.
Got it.
So they use this example of Bahrain and India.
Okay.
So a company in Bahrain could outsource its payroll processing, to another company in Bahrain.
Right.
Or they could outsource it to a company in India.
Got it.
But offshoring from Bahrain would mean actually moving the process itself to a subsidiary or to a third-party provider in India.
Got it. Okay, so offshoring, it always has this cross-border move.
Right.
Whereas outsourcing, it's about who's doing it.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, now, in this context, they introduce this term, captive organizations.
Yeah.
What are those?
So captive organizations are basically overseas subsidiaries that are established by a multinational corporation.
Right.
To perform specific functions. So, they represent a form of offshoring, but the parent company retains ownership.
Okay. So it's not a third party. It's still them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, got it. So it seems like the primary motivation behind offshoring is really to get that competitive advantage, largely through lower cost. And then they mention this, especially in the service sector.
Yeah.
Things like banking, software development, legal services, customer support. And they even ask us to think about examples in Bahrain. So what kind of offshoring activities might we see there?
So, Bahrain is a big financial hub.
It is, yeah.
So you could see, multinational banks or financial institutions setting up these captive shared service centers there.
Okay.
To handle things like regional or even global back office processing, IT support, customer service. You might see, companies outsourcing specific IT functions to providers in Bahrain.
Okay.
Taking advantage of their expertise or the cost structure there.
Right. So lots of potential in Bahrain.
Yeah.
But of course there's potential problems as well.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, it's not all sunshine and roses. So the chapter points out Wilcox's observation that there's actually been this kind of plateau, maybe even a decline, in service offshoring.
Yeah.
And he says that less than 15% of all service jobs are still being offshored. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think part of it is that the nature of the service jobs is changing. They require more interaction with the customer, or maybe they're more tightly integrated with the core business processes, so it's just harder to offshore.
Yeah.
And then there's also this growing concern that too much offshoring can hurt the long-term goals of the company. Maintaining quality standards, driving those productivity improvements, even redeploying knowledge workers to more strategic tasks in the home country.
Yeah.
And, you're going to get resistance from employees who fear, losing their jobs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And beyond all that, there's some very practical challenges that you can encounter, right?
Yeah, for sure.
When you're offshoring. So
one is just unclear expectations between the company and the offshore provider.
Right.
And then there's exchange rate fluctuations,
Oh, right.
And then there's higher costs than you might think, just for selecting and monitoring these partners.
Oh, yeah.
And then managing the global network.
Right.
And, the risk that your supplier is going to behave opportunistically, like maybe try and renegotiate the terms after they become, critical.
Right.
And maybe one of the most important, especially for a lot of industries, is this difficulty in safeguarding intellectual property.
Oh, of course. So it's not just about, finding a place where it's cheaper to do it.
No,
It's way more complex than that.
it is.
Okay. So that kind of leads us to this question of deciding on location attractiveness. And the chapter mentions Wilcox. He groups all these, 20 different factors into 6 key areas.
Right.
So what are those 6 areas that he's identified?
So it's a really comprehensive framework, and he's trying to figure out, how attractive a particular country is.
Okay.
The 6 areas are costs, like labor, real estate, utilities, all that.
Yeah.
The skills and availability of the workforce, are they skilled and how available are they?
Okay.
The overall business and living environment, how easy is it to do business, the regulatory landscape, even the quality of life if you're sending expats there.
Right.
The quality of the infrastructure, things like transportation, communication networks, energy supply,
Okay.
risk profile, so, political, economic, and security risks.
Right.
And then the potential of the market, how big is it and how much is it going to grow?
Okay. Yeah.
And the big takeaway here is don't just focus on cost savings.
Yeah.
You really need to think about the location and how it's going to contribute to your overall business and your competitive position.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the chapter kind of poses this question to us. They say, is Bahrain an attractive location
Right.
based on those 6 factors?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, Bahrain has a really well-established financial sector, a relatively skilled workforce. They're trying to make it a business-friendly environment. They generally have pretty good infrastructure, and they have a good strategic location within, a major regional market.
Okay.
So there's a lot of attractive things.
Right.
But to really give you a good answer, we would have to do a deep dive into those 6 areas.
Yeah.
And we'd have to think about, what are the needs of the multinational enterprise? What are the priorities? Maybe the risk profile or the availability of a certain kind of technical skills might be a big factor.
Right.
So it really depends.
So attractiveness is really in the eye of the beholder.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Now the last section of the chapter, it explores global business and IT services, sourcing decisions and risk. They start by pointing out how big the market for IT and business services outsourcing is, and a lot of that's offshore. So what are some typical areas that fall under IT outsourcing, ITO, and business process outsourcing, BPO?
Sure. So in ITO, you're talking about things like managing your core IT infrastructure, like mainframes and desktops, data storage solutions, payroll systems,
Okay.
software development and maintenance, SaaS solutions and IT consulting services. And then for BPO, you have things like procurement, accounting, and finance, legal services, call center operations, customer support, even things like online booking and reservation systems.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's lots of different potential areas there. And then the chapter raises some questions from Wilcox about the risk associated with IT outsourcing and offshoring.
Right.
So the first one he asks is, what are the available outsourcing options? And he distinguishes between total outsourcing, total in-house sourcing, and selective sourcing. So what are the differences between those 3?
So total outsourcing means that more than 80% of a particular function's operating budget is managed and provided by an external provider.
Okay.
And total in-house sourcing means the company keeps more than 80% of that budget in-house.
Okay.
And then selective outsourcing is that hybrid approach where maybe 20% to 80% of the budget is managed in-house and then the rest is strategically outsourced.
Okay. So a company can kind of choose where on that spectrum they want to be.
Exactly.
And then the next question he asks is about the number of providers. So should a company go with multiple providers or should they go with a single provider? So what are the pros and cons of each of those strategies?
So multi-sourcing, working with a lot of providers, it gives you the advantage of selecting the best provider for each need.
Okay.
Right. It mitigates risk because you're not relying on one vendor.
Right.
And it gives you more flexibility.
Okay.
But the downside is it's going to cost more
Yeah.
to manage all those relationships. And the single provider approach can, simplify things. It can reduce your costs and you might get some economies of scale,
Right.
but then it makes it harder to switch if you're not happy.
Right.
And you're more reliant on that one provider.
So there's trade-offs on either side.
There are, yeah.
Okay. And then they introduce this 4 activities matrix, which is this framework for deciding which IT activities to outsource.
Right.
And this seems like a really useful tool.
Yeah, it is.
So can you break it down? Like, what are the 2 axes, and then what are the 4 quadrants that come out of that?
Sure. So basically, they're evaluating activities on these 2 dimensions. One is contribution to business operations.
Okay.
So is it like critical to the business or just useful?
Yeah.
And then the other is contribution to competitive positioning.
Okay.
So is it like a differentiator for the company, or is it more of a commodity?
Okay. So based on those 2 axes, what are the 4 quadrants?
Okay, so the first one is order winners.
Okay.
So those are the activities that are both critical to operations and a key differentiator.
Keep those in-house.
Yeah, keep those in-house.
Okay.
Then you have qualifiers.
Okay.
Those are critical to the operation, but they're like a commodity.
Okay.
So maybe those are better sourced through strategic partnerships.
Okay.
They give the example of aircraft maintenance systems, BASS, in Bahrain.
Okay.
And then you have what they call useful commodities, sometimes called necessary evils. These are activities that are useful,
Okay.
but they don't give you any competitive advantage.
Okay.
So that's administration, inventory, payroll.
Those are good for outsourcing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have distractions.
Distractions.
Yeah. Those are the things that the company is maybe trying to use as a differentiator, but they're not doing a good job. Host speaker.